The bill is to require an official declaration of war or other congressional action before the South Dakota National Guard may be deployed by the federal government. Are there any people here to speak for the bill? Senator Pischke, welcome to the first committee. You have the honor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Senator Tom Pischke from District 25, Del Rapids. Just a comment before we get going. It's my understanding that we have a couple online testifiers that have not received the link, so I'm wondering if that could be sent to them. It's pretty vital that we get those people to testify. So,
I think they were working on that. I think they've got them. Do you have them connected?
Mr. Chair, they should be up in the queue there if they got it. And
There's no one in the queue right now. I asked the one guy to forward the one in the
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and have testimony first from the audience, and then we'll make sure we can try to get it. And we'll get on, Tom. And
that's fine. I just want to know. I think there has been some technical issues here or something. So, so I just did want to make sure that those experts were able to testify. So, but I'll proceed with my testimony, Mr. Chair. Bring before you today Senate Bill 82, an act to require an official declaration of war or other congressional act before the South Dakota National Guard may be deployed by the federal government. I believe that South Dakota truly has the best National Guard, and this bill is being brought forth so we can show our respect to each and every one of the enlisted soldiers by following our constitutions. This bill's been brought in the past, but I think that's really the best time right now to make sure that we move this forward and pass it, given the current situation, our southern border, and the conflicts blowing up on the other side of the world that we're engaged in. There are many reasons why this bill is important, but I believe the top reason is because it saves lives, it helps protect our state, and helps protect our union of states, and create a better economic situation, and helps recognize the governor's proper authority and make Congress act in a constitutional way. The goal of the bill is to restore authority as it's laid out in our state constitution and our federal constitution, so that the National Guard in the Union, the best National Guard in the Union, can act in the best possible way. For far too long, the federal government has abused its powers and has also abdicated certain powers in other areas. One of those being Article 1, which is in the U.S. legislative branch of Section 8, Clause 15, which reads, "The Congress shall have the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions." The other area of the Constitution is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, which reads, "The Congress shall have the power to declare war." So the main reason that I believe that we should bring this forward and pass this legislation is that I believe that our governor is the commander-in-chief of our South Dakota National Guard. He's the one that should say when our young men should be deployed within our nation, and this legislation helps defend that. This does not affect anybody that's in any other branches. This only affects the South Dakota National Guard. So with that, I will turn it over to other testimony and stand by for questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Pischke. Is there any other testimony, any other proponent testimony? Pardon me? Proponent.
Mr. Chair. Representative Aaron Elward out of District 6, Harrisburg, South Dakota, testifying on behalf of myself. I come to you here today. I've brought this bill a number of years in the past. It's something that I firmly believe in. It's a true restoration of federalism type of bill. And, I think things have gotten quite skewed over the last 70, 75, close to 80 years now, ever since World War II, where that, as Senator Pischke had mentioned, that power that's supposed to lie within Congress has been abdicated. It's been moved over to the federal executive, and now we currently work under the AUMF, and even those seem to get, I don't know if abuse is the right word to put in there, but they get used quite often when at the end of the day, on each one of these involvements, these wars, these conflicts where you're putting our men and women of South Dakota in harm's way, that's on Congress. And I put a lot of this blame on Congress, on our federal government, the vast majority of it. That power should be retained underneath the governor with our state National Guard. This bill wouldn't prevent, Governor Roden from sending our troops down to the southern border, to a different state to help out with emergencies, things within our own borders of South Dakota with emergencies. Our governor of the state would still retain all the power that they have. This bill, if you boil it down, it essentially says, Congress, if you want to use our South Dakota National Guard, you got to do one thing. Take a stinking vote on a declaration of war. That's what it boils down to. You'll hear from some other good proponents, but I realize we get a lot of federal funding with our state National Guard. But with that, the way the structure's changed with Secretary of Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth now as well, I think that changes a lot of things. He's been a vocal supporter of this legislation as we've seen it across a number of states. And I don't see him with his department withholding any federal funding when this is something that he supports. And just one last thing, this bill, myself, Senator Pischke, we are not veterans, but we have family members that are. It's something that's very important to us. You see a number of other legislators that have signed on. It seems like the interest grows every year, but you see in a lot of other states that there are veterans that bring this legislation. Just for an example, down in Arizona, Air Force vet Wendy Rogers, I believe she's a colonel down there. She made it through the Senate. A friend of mine, Ben Adams, out in Idaho, he's a Marine vet. They made it through the Senate over there. And then another friend of mine, Air Force vet Pat McGeehan, out in West Virginia. Hasn't had a whole lot of luck out in West Virginia either, but he keeps fighting the good fight, and I hope it's something that continues to move forward. And at the end of the day, again, what it comes down to is the proper restoration of power and not putting the men and women of this state into conflicts, into wars that haven't been declared by Congress. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other proponents from the audience? Do we have proponents that are online? Anyone?
He just needs to unmute himself.
You have one.
Can you introduce yourself and where you're from, please?
Hi, is that me?
Mr. Horton?
Yes, thank you so much for having me here today. I'll just be a minute. There are big changes going on in the country today, as we all know. And President Trump has won, frankly, his third election in a row on the movement of Make America Great Again. And a major part of that is America First. And America First doesn't mean selfishness and belligerence. It means defend America first and turn our back on the globalist foreign policy of the previous generation. It's not just a Trump movement. It's a reorientation of the entire American right against globalism and interventionism. And quite frankly, if you guys have seen with Trump issuing his order against all foreign aid, he has made it clear previously he intends to really roll back American forces throughout Europe and Asia and the Middle East and bring them home, and clearly wants to have at least 4 years of peace in a row here, and no more wars or proxy wars. but he needs a movement out here in the country backing him. If you remember the last time Trump was president, it was sort of him versus the executive branch, and they didn't let him get away with much. And he has a much greater mandate, much more freedom of movement this time, but he needs support out in the country. He needs a movement of MAGA, America Firster, non-interventionists supporting him. And the thing is he already has one. Here's a parade that he can now lead, and a parade that can back him out here in the country. It's the Defend the Guard movement. It's led by Dan McKnight and the guys that Bring Our Troops Home. They're all veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, our current generation of war. They're all American patriots, right-leaning guys and veterans. And they have been pushing throughout the 50 states here, and with some pretty good success. They haven't gotten it signed yet, but they've made it through many state houses and senates and prominent committees. And I think this really can be their year to push this through. And I really hope that you guys can really help and take the lead in doing this and making it known that here you have a movement of American veterans and patriots who are using the constitutional remedy of invoking what should be the state's reserved powers over these National Guard forces, whose job truly is to help in floods and earthquakes, and God forbid a riot, they would help the local sheriff keep the peace or something. But otherwise, they shouldn't be reserve forces for foreign war unless absolutely necessary to take them away from their primary duty here. And if it's that important that they do so, then that's fine. The president can seek a constitutional declaration of war from the Congress, obtain one, and then have his troops. And as we know, the presidents and first of all, the Congress doesn't like taking responsibility, and the president likes taking responsibility a lot of times. And so they kind of conspire to pass these authorizations to use force to let the president decide. But that has been, as we've seen over the previous generation, has made it too easy for our presidents to go to wars that we all end up later regretting. And especially regretting that our guardsmen were overseas on a losing adventure when they could have been home protecting their own populations from natural disasters and the rest. So this is our year. This is such a great opportunity, especially for this Senate and your state, to take the lead, to set an example for the rest of the states, for the MAGA movement, for the America First movement, that this is what we're doing. And after all, we're talking about the U.S. Constitution here. It is the law. It's the same one that you all take your oath to, that these soldiers all take their oath to. And, you know, they actually, a lot of these guys saw their friends die for it. They take it very seriously. And so they, I believe, are owed by the politicians to live up to their oath as well. And so that's George Washington's legacy, and it's an important responsibility. So I hope that you guys will do the right thing and support this bill and finally put America first. Thank you.
Mr. Horton, can you tell us where you were from?
I'm from Austin, Texas. I hope you won't hold it against me that I'm not from your home state, but I'm sure with you guys in spirit there. And I'm very appreciative of those who've sponsored and moved this bill forward.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Horton. Any questions for Mr. Horton? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Do we have any other testimony from online? We're going to wait just a minute. None?
I don't think so.
Do we have any other testimony online?
No one else is on.
We're going to move to opponents. Do we have any opponents to this bill?
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, General. Welcome.
Thank you. I am Mark Morrell, the Adjutant General of the state of South Dakota. And I come before you today in opposition to Senate Bill 82. Thanks, Mr. Chair, as well as members of the committee. Appreciate your time. Many of you have seen our threat brief on the People's Republic of China, our pacing threat, and other world actors that would seek to harm us and democracy across the globe. You see, we live in a consequential time in a very dangerous world. If passed, this bill seeks to inhibit the South Dakota National Guard's ability to support the national defense strategy to defend and deter and to win. I must go a little bit further in stating that the mission of the South Dakota National Guard is to fight and win our nation's wars. We are the primary combat reserve of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. It is the manner in which the Department of Defense has organized its military forces across the nation. The Constitution does give Congress the authority to organize, arm, and discipline a militia and to govern those parts employed in the service of the United States, reserving solely for the states the authority to appoint officers and execute the training of the forces as prescribed by Congress. The National Guard is established by Article 1, Section 8, and in clauses 15, 16, which you've heard talked about already, the U.S. Constitution, serves as a vital dual status force operating both on state and federal authority simultaneously. Each of our service members is a member of the National Guard of South Dakota and simultaneously the National Guard of the United States. These important legal distinctions are codified in law and underpin our high level of readiness. When individuals enlist in the South Dakota National Guard, they commit to an oath that emphasizes their dedication to protecting and upholding the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of South Dakota. This dual membership empowers the President to mobilize the National Guard using a variety of authorities codified in U.S. Code to enforce the laws of the nation, quell insurrections, repel invasions, and safeguard the nation, as you've heard before. This critical dual role ensures the federal government is well equipped to swiftly respond to and effectively to respond to threats, whether they arise within our borders or from abroad, thereby bolstering the safety and security of our nation. Moreover, Senate Bill 82 legislation stands in direct opposition of existing federal law, raising significant concerns about its constitutionality. As it currently stands, the Supremacy Clause of the United States in Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution clearly establishes that the federal laws and treaties take precedence over conflicting state laws. This clause is a vital pillar of federalism, ensuring a cohesive legal framework while maintaining a balance of power between federal and state governments. For example, the South Dakota Air National Guard is currently supporting National Aerospace Sovereignty Mission at March Air Reserve Base in Riverside, California. We have been involved in this mission for more than 12 years. We have armed jets and pilots on alert 24/7, 365, without fail. The Aerospace Control Alert Mission is a modern continental air defense initiative that was initially developed during the Cold War in defense against Soviet manned bomber attacks coming across primarily the North Pole. Its primary objective is to prevent air attacks against the continent of North America, safeguard the sovereign airspaces of the United States and Canada in partnership. It is a combined command. We also respond to unknown, unwarranted, and unauthorized air activity and provide aerospace and maritime warning for North America. And without delving into classified intelligence, let me assure you that we need the full range of movement and to do so at great distances from the continental United States in order to perform this mission, which requires us to have armed fighters on status, potentially flying over other sovereign national airspace. We do this job in the National Guard with F-15 Eagles, F-16 Fighting Falcons, which we fly here in South Dakota at the 114th Fighter Wing, and F-22s. The pilots and jets of South Dakota Air National Guard stand ready, on alert, as I said, 24/7, 365. While on standby and for training, they operate under a Title 32 status, which is state control. Meaning, once they are scrambled, they automatically switch to a Title 10 or federal controlled status. I must emphasize that in both statuses, the federal government pays the bill for all that readiness. Since this mission requires support to both Canada and a great deal of the Caribbean, this would not be permissible under a bill of this kind proposed in this way. In addition, let me say that I think we've been here before. As recently as 1990, there was a challenge by the state of Minnesota who opposed using its troops to deploy to Central America. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and federal supremacy was upheld. There's a bit of nuance here, but suffice to say that anytime a military force is used overseas, it must be done under a Title X or a federal authority. State governors simply have no authority outside of their states or the United States collectively. Given this fundamental principle, the legal challenges faced by Senate Bill 82 not only are complex, but are fraught with uncertainty and underscore the urgent need to reconsider this legislation's alignment with federal authority. This is the 5th time that this bill has been brought before the South Dakota legislature and is yet to pass. I know there was a House concurrent resolution passed in 2022. Similar legislation, as you've heard, has been proposed in many other states, but no state has adopted this dangerous legislation yet. And that should tell you something about the legislation itself. I believe this legislation is unwise because it presents a common, I believe, misunderstanding about federal constitutional law applicable to the National Guard. If adopted, it may limit the National Guard and risk losing its standing as the primary combat integrated reserve of both the Army and the Air Force. It would also damage the reputation of the armed forces of South Dakota as one of the preeminent units in the nation. The idea that a state can force the federal government to use a declaration of war by prohibiting their National Guards from mobilizing is, I believe, tactically poor and constitutionally not possible. The existing law that has been reinstated time and again has clarified this principle over time. The bill references Article 1, Section 8, and Clause 11 as well of the Constitution. That same clause of the Constitution has a provision that discusses what is commonly referred to as the AUMF, or the authorizations for use of military force. The Supreme Court has long construed that declare war clause to mean that Congress can issue formal declarations of war and authorize the use of armed forces for more limited operations short of full-scale war. On various occasions, Congress has passed what has become known as AUMFs, which permit the President to use the United States military forces to pursue set objectives within defined parameters. Early examples include congressional authorization to protect American commercial vessels from pirates and hostile foreign countries. So this has been going on for quite a long time. Since the Second World War, Congress has not formally declared war, and AUMFs have become the predominant method to authorize use of force. For example, Congress passed and the President signed into law statutory authorization during the Persian Gulf War of 1991, post-September 11, 2001, the invasion of Afghanistan, and the 2003 Iraq War. While declarations of war authorize total war, providing the President with the entire and unqualified use of the U.S. military, AUMF authorizes a more limited use of force. AUMF is approved by Congress and is consistent with a declaration of war. For those reasons, I think this bill is probably just not necessary. It poses a significant risk to our national security and could potentially hinder our country's defense capabilities. Attempting to limit federal access to the South Dakota National Guard, if successful, would hinder our national security for sure. The National Defense Strategy requires the accessibility of all military personnel, including the South Dakota National Guard, to support and defend U.S. interests when needed. The South Dakota National Guard's ability to deploy quickly and effectively is crucial to the success of this strategy. States like ours benefit greatly from substantial federal support for training, equipment, and modernization of our National Guard units. However, if our states restricts deployments, it risks alienating the federal government, which may reconsider or reduce funding for National Guard programs. The potential loss of federal support could leave our Guard units with outdated equipment, limited training, and significantly diminish our effectiveness in both state and federal missions, impacting the welfare of our airmen, soldiers, and citizens alike. The South Dakota National Guard has an economic impact of over $236 million this last year, with only 4% of that being state fund investment. The reduced federal funding resulting from such a bill's passage would mean fewer South Dakota National Guard personnel, less equipment available during state emergencies as well. It could also significantly increase the state's cost to respond to emergencies, potentially straining state resources and budgets. Perhaps one thing that the bringers of this bill might consider is an unorganized militia, also outlined in the Constitution, which several states have done. I'll just remind the committee and those viewing here that An unorganized militia is a self-funded way to have a state force that might have the state might retain complete control over. But they would be fundamentally different from the National Guard or the organized militia as outlined in the Constitution, which is the primary combat reserve of the Army and the Air Force. Federal courts have long recognized the National Guard's hybrid nature as a state and federal agency, as each member of the state National Guard is also a member of the National Guard of the United States, may be activated for federal status at any time, and then in exchange for following federal regulations, the state National Guard receives federal recognition, arms, equipment, and funding. While this proposal to limit deployment of the South Dakota National Guard to federal service in specific contexts may stem from a desire to protect state sovereignty, the potential consequences of such legislation outweigh any perceived benefits. The bill undermines constitutional provisions related to national security, risks military flexibility, introduces inefficiencies in federal-state coordination, and could weaken the United States' global standing. The current framework for the National Guard ensures a balance of power between states and federal authorities and has proven effective in responding to national emergencies. Altering this balance could lead to dangerous delays, legal complexities, and diminished ability to address both domestic and international security threats. It would also weaken and demoralize your South Dakota National Guard. While we do deploy for war, it is important noting that we deploy a lot for things other than war. One of the most important tools of the U.S. military is in partnership and training and in campaigning with partners and allies. And it is an essential tool of government power. And as I said before, leaving the continental United States requires us to be under federal authority. And this bill would throw that into question as well. I do appreciate the intentions behind this bill, behind the bill's sponsors. I also strongly urge them to refrain from using the South Dakota National Guard as a potential pawn in between the state and the federal government for this purpose. I believe it would be far more effective to simply have a dialogue with our congressional delegation in Washington about these concerns. Since September 11, 2001, the South Dakota National Guard has deployed more than 10,500 airmen and soldiers, some of them in wartime environments, many in not. When our soldiers and airmen enlist in the South Dakota National Guard, they commit to being part of a team and contributing to something greater than themselves. They understand that signing up to serve often means they will be deployed. Moreover, they want to. The young people who join our forces are eager for the adventure that goes along with overseas deployments. In conclusion, I'll say yesterday we heard from Governor Roden, who made it clear that he has an unwavering commitment to keeping South Dakota strong, safe, and free. However, the passage of this bill would jeopardize both our strength and our safety. Without these fundamental pillars, our freedom will be nothing more than an illusion, and I believe we must stand firm against those things which threaten our core values. I thank you for your time, and I ask that you would vote no on Senate Bill 82. I will stand for questions.
Thank you, General. Is there any other opponent testimony?
Mr. Chairman, I did not sign up. Can I speak as a...
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely, Senator. We can get you to sign up later. Okay.
My name is Glenn Billhauer. I'm the senator from District 5, Watertown. I wasn't planning on testifying. I just want to sit in and observe the hearing this afternoon. I am a veteran of the National Guard. I served back from 1976 to 1986. And fortunately, I served at a time when I was never activated either on a state level or on a federal level, but I was ready to serve. That was my mission. And I know I had a twofold mission. One was to serve the state of South Dakota, and one was to protect the United States of America. Like I say, fortunately, never had to do anything along those lines. But over the years, I've observed the mission of the Guard, and that mission has not changed in the last 40 to 50 years, in my understanding. I can't speak to the constitutionality of this. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because I don't understand it necessarily. But I can speak of what my understanding was as a member of the Guard. I was ready to serve, willing to serve, wanted to serve if called upon. And over the years, as I've observed Guard units around the state and around the country, they are serving a critical role for the defense of our country in areas where there is no war going on. So that concerns me, that we look at taking away that defense of our country and other countries by passing this sort of legislation, I think is very short-sighted as far as what it means to us as members of the South Dakota National Guard and as citizens of this state. So I would strongly support this committee turning down this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We have another testifier on, and I think he's a proponent, right? So let me see if we can get him on here. Pardon me? Mr. McKnight, are you on? Can you hear me, Mr. McKnight?
He needs to unmute.
All right, there. Can you hear me okay, sir?
There you go. There you go. Would you introduce yourself and where you're from, please?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you. My name is Dan McKnight. I'm a 13-year veteran of the United States Marine Corps, United States Army, and the Idaho Army National Guard. I currently reside in Eagle, Idaho, and I'm the chairman of a large national veterans organization called Bring Our Troops Home. I'm here to urge your consideration and recommendation to pass for SB 82, Defend the Guard bill. I'm going to skip most of my prepared testimony and talk about some things that have been talked about and maybe offer some clarity and then hopefully stand for a question or two. At its core, SB 82 is about reinforcing constitutional law and closing some loopholes that have led to the misuse of states' National Guard units. It ensures that units like the South Dakota National Guard cannot be deployed overseas in a combat role at the discretion of a single individual or an unelected bureaucrat, but only when duty, law, and formal congressional war declaration require it. So the president does have limited authority to federalize the National Guard. In the Constitution, that authority is found in three things: to repel an invasion, to suppress an insurrection, and to enforce the laws of the Union. And beyond those authorities, federal law further says that the president can nationalize the National Guard under Title 10 of U.S. Code. And there's some very specific instances when he can do this. Title 10 USC Section 12301 subsection A says that he can have a full mobilization of the National Guard if Congress declares war. So it's already said in there. It says it can last for the duration of the war plus 6 months. 12301B says that there can be voluntary activation, meaning the guardsmen themselves can volunteer for up to 1 year to go on active duty. 12301D says the president can take voluntary active duty from individual members who can opt into federal service outside of their units. And then, of course, there's the stop-loss authority. If we're in war, he can stop people from leaving the National Guard. So those are the authorities in federal law that currently says the president can take the National Guard units. That's under Title 10. And what's interesting is that in two of those codes, the governor already has the authority to refuse or to object to the federalization of their National Guard. And the Supreme Court came back in a decision called Perpich v. Department of Defense and said that the only time the governors can't object is when the federal government or the president of the United States federalizes their National Guard units to go outside of the continental United States for the purpose of training. They purposely left out the issue of war because it's already been addressed in the Constitution. But what happens is when there's a little bit of a loophole, we drive a Mack truck through it. And that's what's happened, and that's what we're here to fix with the Defend the Guard Act. That's exactly why we need SB 82. The problem is that there's unchecked executive overreach and there's endless wars, and we know that Congress hasn't formally declared war since 1942, but we've been to Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq 2, 3, Syria, Yemen, Djibouti, Africa, all across the Horn of Africa. And rather than following the Constitution, Congress has actually relied on an open-ended authorization for use of military force. We heard the general talk about that previously. It is not the same thing as a declaration of war. It is a blank check from Congress telling the president that he gets to decide to change the condition of our country from one of peace to one of war, which is not what the Constitution says. And so an AUMF is actually not the same as a declaration of war, but I do appreciate the comments from the general. Additionally, the 1973 War Powers Resolution was meant to rein in the executive overreach by requiring Congress to approve military action within 60 days of its starting. Coincidentally enough, it's never been challenged or held up by Congress. They've never done their job and held the president to the standard of the War Powers Resolution. So, Defend the Guard, the states. The states must now interpose between their own militia and the overreaching arm of the federal government. And because of these loopholes in Title 10 and abuses from the misapplication of the War Powers Act and the abdication of congressional duty by Congress, South Dakota National Guard members, our friends, our neighbors, and our family members have been deployed to foreign conflicts without a formal declaration of war. And a recent case study of this is the Syrian civil war. President Obama in 2013 went to Congress and asked for authorization to use the military in Syria, and Congress said no. President Obama went anyway, and he cited a 2001 AUMF for Afghanistan as his authority to do it. And at the beginning of that war, less than 3% of the boots on the ground or those serving in an instrumentality of war were from the National Guard. And when al-Assad regime fell in December of 2024, 58% of the troops on the ground that we were being told were there were from the National Guard. It gets even better because in the middle of December on the 19th, the Department of Defense finally came out and said, we've been lying. We've been lying. There's not 900 troops there. There's 2,000 and 1,100 more than they ever reported in the past. And again, 58% of those 2,000 troops were from the National Guard. So the misuse of our citizen soldiers is exactly what SB 82 is here to seek to prevent. The National Guard was never meant to be an auxiliary force for endless wars. It was meant to be for the defense of America to backfill the active duty military performing their constitutional duties. It's never been intended to be a substitute for an all-volunteer professional military, and that's exactly what's happened. So it is necessary, it is lawful, and it does prevent the National Guard from going into places that the United States military doesn't have the authority from our representatives to be. So what does Defend the Guard do? It restores constitutional balances and it protects the South Dakota Guardsmen from being deployed into unconstitutional and foreign wars. If war is necessary, the National Guard should be the force that activates, fights, and wins America's wars. And they can only do that properly if we take off the handcuffs and let them do their job. And that doesn't happen when Congress doesn't have skin in the game. So with this bill, we're asking that Congress puts their name on the line in a formal declaration before we put our boots on the ground. And when they do it the right way, they have the informed consent of the American people, and America, every zip code in America, will line up to support that effort. Thank you for your time. I'll stand for any questions that you may have about Defend the Guard.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions before I close off the proponents or opponents? Proponents. Do we have another one online?
You already went.
You already left?
You already went.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're going to close the proponents off and go back to opponents. So is there any other opponents that wish to speak towards this bill? Rebuttal?
Yep.
Mr. Chair.
Does this have to be sponsor?
Sponsor rebuttal.
Sponsor rebuttal.
Can I let him do it for me?
Can they do that? I think they can do that. You're lucky today, sir.
I am a lucky guy.
Go on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Aaron Elward from District 6, Harrisburg, South Dakota. As I was thinking through that, I know the general went and then the good Dan McKnight went, and I think he kind of gave a rebuttal there. He said he was kind of passing up some of his proponent testimony, but I'll just add a couple of things that I wanted to point out, and Mr. McKnight touched on them as well. I think a lot of people mistaken the supremacy clause of the federal Constitution. They forget that part where it says in pursuance thereof. I agree. States have to follow what the federal government does for laws. But when we do that, it needs to be in pursuance of what the powers are laid out, what powers are laid out in the federal Constitution. So when we start to go haywire as states, or if the federal government starts to go off track on certain laws that are made, and if those things aren't in pursuance thereof of the enumerated powers that are in the federal government, we're off track. So I just wanted to make that one correction. I think that's a misconception that a lot of people have. It's not states you need to fall in line with every jot and tittle that the federal government tells you. And then I just wanted to bring up the Perpich versus Secretary of DOD back in the early 90s too. Mr. McKnight touched on that, but again, that was just for training purposes. And a number of things that are laid out in Title 10 support what we're advocating for here today, which you heard from Mr. McKnight. So I appreciate your support. I hope you vote in favor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, now it's time to move to questions from the committee. Questions from the committee. Senator Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for the Prime. So if, let's say, some security forces troops from Ellsworth were deployed overseas, is there anything in here that would prevent our National Guard from being deployed to Ellsworth to backfill those troops?
With a declaration of war, they could go overseas, but backfilling, there's nothing in the bill that would prevent from backfilling with our National Guard.
So, Mr. Chair, follow up just to make sure it's clear. So our National Guard troops could be deployed anywhere in the continental U.S. without an act of war?
Mr. Chair? That is correct, Senator Howard. Yep, anywhere in the basically it would be anywhere in the United States domestically they could be deployed, by our governor, our commander-in-chief here in South Dakota.
Are there any other questions? Senator Holm.
Mr. Chair, I have a few. I'd actually like to ask the Prime sponsor, but then also ask either General Morrell or Secretary Michaels. First of all, what is the process on determining, who, like the active versus the National Guard, as far as determining when they would get deployed?
Mr. Chair, I'll do my best to answer. So, what is the process? I mean, I'm not in the Guard, and not familiar with exactly the process. My understanding is that if to be deployed overseas, in accordance with the Constitution, there needs to be a declaration of war. But obviously, as we've heard testimony, our National Guard is being deployed overseas, and without a declaration of war. There hasn't been one since 1942. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my understanding.
Okay, follow up. So, say that there's troops that are deployed overseas, but yet we maybe have a crisis at our southern border. What is the hierarchy, or how is that determined on who gets precedence?
Mr. Chair, I'll do my best to answer. Well, if there's a conflict overseas, still all the other branches of the military could still be deployed overseas. It doesn't affect that, so I would assume that they would go overseas, and our National Guard could be deployed here at home within the United States. That's how I would see that happening. I mean, again, I'm not in the military. I can't answer those specific questions, but that's how I would see it as.
Can I have General Morrell or Secretary Michaels answer those questions?
Mr. Chair, Senator, would you mind just giving me them in order again so I can be accurate?
Oh, so thank you. I'm just wondering, the process on how you make the determination of whether to deploy your active versus National Guard units overseas.
Mr. Chair, Senator, thank you for that question. Sue, that's a complicated problem. To be as succinct as possible, I'd say that is a process that is well established inside the Department of Defense, taking into account all of its forces. So ultimately, a need is identified for a requirement somewhere on the globe. All the service secretaries get together with their forces and figure out who can present forces that can accomplish that task. They bring those forward to eventually the Secretary of Defense, and he decides what forces are going to go where, he or she. So active and reserve component, so there's the active component and there's the Army or Air Force Reserve, and then there's the Army and Air Force National Guard as well, Air National Guard as well. And those each have separate command structures and have separate readiness cycles as well. So which component is used in that, we tend to be pretty agnostic about that. It depends on who is ready and who can accomplish the mission. Sorry if that's quite vague, but that's in very broad terms how that works. So I am as the Adjutant General of South Dakota, nor does the Governor of South Dakota ever decide whether or not it's time to deploy in support of an overseas operation the National Guard. That is a federal mobilization authority. A few of them have been articulated already. There's about 10 different. I think one of the proponents mentioned about 4 of them. There's about 10 different mobilization authorities that allow for that to happen for different durations for different purposes and different quantities and scales. It's complicated.
Follow-up. Okay, so my understanding is the National Guard, their capacity is to respond to local crisis. And I'm just kind of wondering, first of all, do you know the percentage of National Guard units that are overseas versus active units that are overseas?
Mr. Chair. And Senator, the short answer to your last question is no. Let me come back to it, though. I'd like to address the first thing you said is the National Guard exists for. So the National Guard's purpose is organized, trained, and equipped as the primary combat reserve of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. So our purpose is we have a dual mission. It's to fight and win our nation's wars, and when called upon by the governor, to protect life and property and secure peace here at home. So it's a dual mission, and it depends on which authority we operate under. The way we're organized, trained, and equipped is a federal construct and a federal funding stream and a federal equipment source that, with training standards that make sure that we are the same state to state across the United States, so that we can be interchangeably used with all of our active counterparts. Does that make sense when I say that?
Follow up, Mr. Chair. Okay, so my understanding is, or can you tell me why don't we deploy? I think most people feel like you deploy the active military first, and then the National Guard is the backup. Is that correct in my understanding?
Mr. Chair, Senator, yeah, that's a big generalization. I would say it really depends. It depends on what kind of a force you're talking about, what their specialty is, what their capability is. By and large, most of the time, I would agree with you that the active component, which is often forward deployed, we have them stationed in other countries, they would be first to react in that particular theater of the globe. And then the National Guard or reserves would backfill or help support them over a period of time, because National Guardsmen are by and large living full civilian lives in addition to their military service. So it takes us a little bit of time to mobilize, right? We have to leave our civilian lives, get to mobilization, double check last minute training, and then proceed forward if it's an overseas deployment. So yes, in general, I'd say big picture, the active component is first, the reserve, the combat reserve is second.
Mr. Chair, so I've received numerous emails and even text messages stating that, like one was, let me just pull that up here. One signed up like in May, and then went through graduation. They graduated, were based in Sioux Falls, and then they ended up getting deployed like 15 months later from being signed up. And so they're over there serving actively overseas, while there's active units here in the United States. So I think there's a lot of concern on why we're deploying our National Guard versus our active military units.
Mr. Chair. Yeah, I can understand, Senator, I can understand that concern. It's and it's difficult for me to construct a real concise way to say why that's happening, other than to say the Department of Defense is a large organization that has many different kinds of units, and all of those units are in some form of mission execution, reset, retraining, mission execution. And through that cycle, some of them are ready and some of them are not. And there's a process within the DoD that's called the Global Force Management Plan. And that takes into account everyone's training cycle that is training to a federal military standard and knows when they're ready to deploy. So the fact that we would deploy a unit on a cycle, especially a known cycle for the National Guard, we genuinely and generally like, because we plan those deployments. They're not surprises to us. So we know typically several months in advance when a unit is going to be deployed from the National Guard, as opposed to the active duty. When I was on active duty, I at one point in time got a 2-week notice for a long-term overseas deployment. That's pretty common. It shouldn't be, but it is. So due to crisis situations, the Guard is not typically like that. So there is warning, even though that troop, whoever it was, an airman or a soldier, went through their training and became part of a unit. It's not, it doesn't surprise me at all that they would have been deployed within 15 months, because their unit was probably showing ready in the global force management construct that they were capable of executing the mission. It was their turn to deploy. Does that make sense?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, another follow-up here. So can you tell me how long?
He may want to enlist you.
Well, no. Just like if, what is the time frame that it would take to get a declaration of war?
Mr. Chair, that's a good question for Congress, ma'am. The National Guard really has nothing to do with that process. We simply present ready forces at time of need and respond to legal authorizations for our use and conduct and execute missions. That's why I said in my testimony that I really think proponents of this bill really ought to take this issue up with Congress. It is it's an argument that appears to be between the executive branch, the federal executive branch, and the federal legislative branch. And to use a single state's National Guard as a pawn in that fight is going to be detrimental to your National Guard.
Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering if there's any proponents for the bill that would like to respond to that. Thank you, General Morrell. And I don't know if proponents or Mr. McKnight would like to respond.
I'm just curious if Mr. McKnight is still on there, if he'd want to respond to that.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm still here.
Mr. McKnight, I don't know if you heard my previous questions, but I just was wondering if you would have any response to any of them.
Yeah, regarding when the National Guard is called out or the backfilling of vacant domestic posts, is that what we're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, the general was very correct. The National Guard is part of the United States of America Department of Defense Force Protection Plan, and different units have different specialties. And the National Guard actually participates in something that's very unique. The active duty military doesn't do it. It's called the State Partnership Program. And what happens is National Guard units align with other nations around the world in different regions and different territories, and they build alliances and do training with them. So if there's a war in Angola, for instance, and maybe the South Dakota National Guard is a state partner with Angola, they will have already built a relationship and have camaraderie and training and dual purpose with the Angola military forces. I'm not sure if that's the South Dakota's partner program or not, but and so if there's a real world emergency that strikes that reaches Angola and America decides it is important enough for us to go to war in Angola, then Congress would convene they could declare war, and I'll answer that question here in just a moment. And then the National Guard from South Dakota would be federalized and sent to fight in a region of the world where they've already trained, they've already got allies, and they've already got a common mission. And so the National Guard is part of this force protection plan, and they fit into it very well. They make up roughly 48 to 50%, depending on recruitment numbers, of the total force structure of the United States Department of Defense. On the question regarding declarations of war, they've happened in as quickly as a couple of hours, and some have taken as long as a couple of weeks. So it depends on the threat facing the United States. So we were able to get a declaration of war in World War II in just a couple of hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So a declaration of war, the time that it takes to produce one by Congress, should never be a deterrent for going into war without one. And we've given our authority to Congress, and that's not an authority that they're allowed to delegate to anybody else. The Constitution is very clear on the enumerated powers. And regarding backfilling, this bill, Defend the Guard, it only deals with the National Guard being federalized under Title 10 and going into fight in combat outside of the United States of America. That's it. All other missions, backfilling, foreign training, foreign humanitarian missions, everything the National Guard currently does as part of their force structure plan is unaffected by this. The only thing that we're doing is closing a loophole that would keep about 50% of our force structure from being able to participate in an unconstitutional, undeclared war. And that's the entire focus of SB 82.
Go ahead.
Last question, Mr. Chair. I'd like to have both sides maybe respond to this, but the concerns for federal funding, do you feel that there would be concern of federal funding being pulled then from us?
Was that question for me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Oh, great. Mr. Chair, Madam Representative, that's a great question. We believe that the threat of federal funding is a red herring, and it's been used in several states to oppose Defend the Guard legislation, but there hasn't been a single credible person from the Department of Defense, 2-star or above, or any elected official that will put their name on any such threat. They always say it could happen, it might happen, it may happen. But in reality, the new Secretary of Defense, who was just nominated last week, Pete Hegseth, is a supporter of the Defend the Guard bill. He gave public statement of support January of last year on Fox News when the New Hampshire House of Representatives passed the bill. He voiced his support of not only the bill itself, but the principle behind it. And we're seeing what he's doing in the Department of Defense right now to realign with constitutional principles. Also, Representative Paul Gosar, who sits on the House Appropriations Committee, recently recorded into the halls of Congress and wrote a public op-ed saying that Congress appropriates the money, not the NGB, the National Guard Bureau, not the Department of Defense, and not any unelected bureaucrat. The money is appropriated by Congress, and no congressman would ever allow for us to weaken a state's defense forces, their readiness, or their ability to protect their citizens and their property out of a punitive action because a state decided to interpose between an overreaching federal government and their own militia. It'd be political suicide. Imagine your representatives or your senators allowing 1 penny of federal funding that would affect the readiness, affect the ability of a Black Hawk helicopter to respond to wildfires in western South Dakota. It wouldn't happen. And like I said, there's never been a credible threat. It's never happened in any state. And there hasn't been anybody that'd be willing to put their name on that actual threat, because there are members of Congress that would like to talk to them as soon as there is somebody that would put their name on that threat.
Okay.
Mr. Chair and Senator, yeah, with respect, I disagree. I think it is a significant threat. Our National Guard in South Dakota is again, organized, trained, and equipped to match a federal force. That equipment involves an entire fighter wing, an artillery battalion, and a bridging company, just to name a handful, that have no true domestic purpose. And if we are not going to train them and equip them and we're not going to be able to use them effectively, I think there will be, over time, and it'll be an easy target to remove funding or replace it with lesser capable units, certainly. Moreover, when we go overseas, whether it's for training or partnering or campaigning, whatever it is, where, as I stated before, we're always in Title 10. We're in Title 10 for a specific reason. Title 10 authority is federal authority because that's the only authority we can be outside of the United States. We have to be representatives of the federal government and the United States at that time. If there is a conflict that arises while we are outside of the United States, what you would effectively have here is a force sitting on the sidelines on the front line of battle, unable to act because of a convoluted permission structure. You see what I'm saying there? Like, they're not allowed, the active component's allowed to fight back, but the reserve component that's sitting there right next to them on the ramp in the foxhole and the firing line is not allowed to fight back because they haven't been authorized yet. Which is why I say, like, to go overseas in Title 10 to say that we can separate the training purpose, the partnering purpose, the campaigning purpose from a combat purpose is, I think, got a few holes in the argument. It'd be very difficult to orchestrate. So that'd be my 2 cents.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any other questions from the three?
Mr. Chair.
Senator Marty.
I'll try to muster up a question or two for the general. And thank you, General. And maybe you've already answered this, but why are so many Guard members used in, like, Afghanistan and Vietnam, and are there not enough military, U.S. military personnel to fill those spots?
Yeah. Mr. Chair. Yeah, Senator, in short, yes. The Department of Defense is quite a bit smaller than it has been at any point in our history, while simultaneously engaged in, perhaps this is one of the arguments of the proponents, that engaged in many different ways and facets across the globe with our partners and our allies. So that, coupled with the fact that there is a training cycle that needs to happen to refresh our teams, whether you're in an active component or reserve component or Guard, the training cycles, you got to give people downtime at some point in time. So there's not enough to go full throttle all the time, if you will. Does that make?
Go ahead.
I had a thought here. Excuse me. Yeah, that went away. Oh, when was National Guard established?
Well, our National Guard was established in 1862.
1862.
Mm-hmm. So we predate statehood here in South Dakota.
So, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
So, like World War I and II and Korea, were there National Guard involved in that then?
Yeah, Mr. Chair. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. Total mobilization during the World Wars.
Oh, okay.
And have been engaged in every. For our National Guard here, I believe, and I don't know if I have this in my notes, it's Spanish-American War. Sorry, I do have some notes about that. I left my glasses, so I'm going to have to squint to read, but we'll do it. The Spanish-American, thanks. Yeah, Spanish-American War was the first one after the inception of the South Dakota National Guard that we participated in.
Okay. Just a comment to the military folks here. I think this bill came about with the frustration of these endless skirmishes, you know, and I'm probably one of those folks that, from my experience in Vietnam, you know, they were unwinnable wars, and like Afghanistan, even Genghis Khan couldn't control Afghanistan. So I think that's why this bill comes out of is frustration. Maybe I'm not reading it right, but I don't know how we correct the endless skirmishes that our military people, National Guard or U.S. guys, people are getting tired of the bodies coming home, and I just think, yeah, I'm torn on this bill. I guess that was more of a commentary, unless you'd want to comment.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind. Senator, with respect, absolutely, I get that. And so my suggestion would be, rather than using your South Dakota National Guard as the pawn or the tool to affect this change, I would encourage you to go to the congressional delegation. That's where the issue lies. It's difficult not to perceive that, let me choose my words carefully. I know your argument is not with your South Dakota National Guard. Right. I would encourage you to consider other ways to accomplish this goal rather than what I feel like would be a quick end result of making the South Dakota National Guard a bit of a pariah within the Department of Defense.
Go ahead.
And this is just maybe a comment. I've dealt with our congressional delegates, and it's very, very hard to get, I don't know if things done, if that's correctly, but, you know, yeah, it's, to get that attention, it would take somebody like you maybe back in Senator Alward, and it's maybe it could be a joint get together with our congressional delegation, and it's just a, I guess, a thought.
Okay. Thank you, Sam. Any other questions from the three before I get into it here? So, General, I got a couple of questions that I've got down here that I'm always worried about legal matters with some of these bills. And I know anybody can take anything to court. I mean, that's just the way it is nowadays. Would you be concerned that this could be challenged in court as unconstitutional?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, absolutely. As I alluded to in my testimony, I think I'm not a lawyer. I'm an old fighter pilot. But as I read it, I think it absolutely would tie us in South Dakota as a state governing body, as well as the South Dakota National Guard, up in controversy and legal proceedings for a good little while. And that's my primary concern. I need to keep my focus on organizing, training, equipping, caring for families of airmen and soldiers, and it would definitely distract Iridia from that. And it would drain resources away from the state as well.
Yeah, and that's a concern of mine, that somewhere along the line, you know, it would be taken to court. South Dakota is held responsible for the funding of all the legal fees, etc. So that would be a concern of mine. And I've got a little bit long one that I put down here, and I'm sure you'll be able to understand this. A declaration of war is a formal act by Congress declaring a state of war with another nation. How would the U.S. declare war against a terrorist organization that resides in multiple countries? And maybe I could ask the sponsor of that. But if you could answer that first, then I'm going to ask the sponsor.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, quite frankly, I don't know the answer to that question. It's a difficult proposition, which has led us to the AUMFs, right? That's why we have done. Congress has chosen, with their enumerated powers to control the purse as well as authorize military force, has chosen a different tool to try to get after that problem. So, difficult problem.
Can I ask the sponsor or co-sponsor? I guess I'm going to ask the co-sponsor that same question. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I appreciate you answering the sponsors. I'm joking.
Representative Aaron Elward, Harrisburg, South Dakota, District 6. Good question. Congress still has to declare war. And to give you an example, if I remember correctly, some of you probably remember President Thomas Jefferson with the Barbary Pirates. A lot of folks think that he just sent forces over there. That was, if I remember correctly, still under a declaration of war at that time. So that would be an example right there. And to my knowledge, those, the Barbary Pirates weren't a nation in itself. So that's the best answer I got for you.
Okay. That's good enough. Thank you, sir. I don't have any more questions. Anybody else have any more questions before we move into the committee discussion and our action? Senator Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our National Guard is like the best in the nation. There's no doubt about that. But I do believe that they, to a large degree, are doing a job that they shouldn't be called upon to do. And I think you even stated that in your opponent testimony, that really, ideally, the National Guard should be the backfill to our active duty troops. And I think I kind of look at this maybe more from the active duty perspective, but I've seen this over the years since I was active duty and our son is now active duty. I think the overuse and misuse of our National Guard troops has caused, to a certain degree, a degradation of our active duty troops. You know, when you talk about we have to deploy this National Guard unit because literally we have no active duty unit that's capable of those duties, that's wrong. That is wrong. Our active duty needs more troops, more equipment, more training, and I think the over-reliance on our National Guard has hurt our active duty. And so my hope, and I will be a yes vote on this, I would encourage a yes vote, but my hope would be that this would send a message to the federal government that says, you can't use our National Guard troops as active duty troops, because that's not what they are, and it was never what they were intended to be. Take care of our active duty troops and let the National Guard return to what their role should be, which to me, and it seems like we all agree that their primary role should be backfilling the active duty troops. So.
Any other discussion?
Mr. Chair, I am concerned also with the accessibility of our congressional delegation. It does seem that, not even in maybe this instance, but other instances, they're just not as accessible to us. I don't know if there can be some type of discussion further down the road with this, but I do agree with Senator Howard that, our troops are being, our National Guard troops are being used, overused, basically. And I've received many, many emails and text messages on this and that concern as well.
Well, I would agree. I think that on our National Guard, I think it's the tops of the country. Real easy to work with. For example, I had a meeting a month ago with the general, and it was good to just sit down with him and be able to talk over some things, etc. So, and we've had nothing but good luck, and I'm prejudiced because I have a grandson that's in the National Guard, but I think ours is the best. There's no doubt about it. Our reserve is the best, and so I'm going to, of course, vote against it. I want you to know that before I vote, and so I think that this is not the time to do this, and I want to thank the two sponsors and co-sponsors for doing this, and I know that you care about our military. I really do, and this shows that you care about our military. So, with that, we're going to move into action. Senator Howard.
Mr. Chair, I would move due pass on SB 82.
Move due pass by Senator Howard. Is there a second? Seconded by Senator Hone. Any discussion?
I would just ask for a yes vote on this, and maybe we can restore the rightful roles for the different branches of our military, and I think this would be a step in that direction. So,
any other discussion? that, we'll call for roll call vote.
Senators Blanc, excused. Howard?
Aye.
Hone?
Aye.
Marty?
Aye.
Zickman?
No.
Mr. Chair, 3 yeas, 1 nay.
It's 3 noes and 1 nay. The motion carries.
3 yeses. And
3.
Pardon me?
3 yeses.
I'm sorry. I tried. Okay, I tried, General. 3 yes and 1 no. Motion carries. Motion passes.